There's this incredible story from Matthew 14 where Jesus walks on water, and actually one of his disciples walks on water as well. You see, they're all seaside with Jesus on the side of a lake, and Jesus tells them, you go ahead and cross the lake, telling the disciples, and he stays there to pray. Well, night falls on the disciples out on the lake, and this heavy wind comes in, and these waves start crashing, and the disciples start to get scared. And they look across the water, just looking for hope, looking for help, and they see this ghost coming towards them, which they are starting to assume maybe that's Jesus. And Peter wants to test that theory out. So we pick up in Matthew 14, verse 28, where Peter cries out to him. It says, then Peter called to him, Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water. Yes, come, Jesus said. So Peter went over to the side of the boat and walked on the water towards Jesus. But when he saw strong wind and waves, he was terrified and began to sink. Save me, Lord, he shouted. Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. You have so little faith, Jesus said. Why did you doubt me? When they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped. Then the disciples worshiped him. You really are the Son of God, they exclaimed. When I read this story, and this is probably a story you've heard before, when I read it, I immediately start to think this is a story just to teach us about not having such little faith as Peter. But there's so much more in this. There's actually five incredible teachings that Peter modeled in this story that we can model as well when we're going through a storm. And I want to go through these 5 verses and these 5 points on how we weather the storm. First of all, that Peter never took his eyes off Jesus. When he started to get scared, he focused on Jesus first, right? He focused on Jesus first. And I think we can do that as well. When we're going through a storm, that we keep our eyes, we focus our hope on Jesus. We look to him, look to Jesus, look to Jesus, look to Jesus. Number 2 is that faith is simply taking the next step out of the boat. What did Peter do that none of the other disciples did? He stepped out of the boat. He believed that Jesus could keep him on top of that water, and he started walking towards him. Faith comes in one step after the other. When Peter was focused on his next step, he stayed on top of that water. It is when he took his eyes off that step towards Jesus that he began to sink, which brings me to number 3, that fear will cause us to sink. When Peter started to get afraid, when he started to look at the waves, when he started to look at all the elements around him other than Jesus, that's when he started to sink. So we have to keep our eyes on Jesus, keep our faith strong. We keep feeding our faith and we keep starving our fears, which brings me to point number 4, when we start to sink. We're not to get ashamed by that. We're not to get ashamed by that fear, that Jesus will save us. If we look to him, he will pull us up right out of that water, just like he did Peter, and he will put us right back in the boat. Jesus has the power to save. And then number 5, when Jesus got back to the boat, when Peter got back in the boat, what does it say in verse 32 that the disciples did? It says, when they climbed back in the boat, the wind stopped. Then the disciples worshiped him. You really are the Son of God, they exclaimed. It says all the disciples worshiped him. Peter didn't sit there in shame. The disciples didn't huddle around him and go, oh, you really messed up, bro. Oh, gosh, let's dry you off. That was so much little faith. Where were you? No, what they did is they immediately started worshiping God. And when we're in the middle of the storm, we can either choose worship or worry. And we're called to choose worship. We keep our eyes on him. So what are those 5 things again? First of all, we keep looking to Jesus. We keep looking to Jesus. Number 2, we keep taking our next step. We focus on our next step. What's your next step today that you can be taking and following Jesus? Number 3 is that fear will cause us to sink, so we are going to choose faith over fear. Number 4 is that Jesus has the power to save us, and we're going to continue to believe that. And number 5 is we're going to choose worship over worry. I choose that for my life this week. Will you choose that for your life this week? Let's journey that together.